Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my co-host extraordinaire, Megan Day, Senior Director of Board Member Experience for Diligent Corporation. Megan, how are you doing today?
You know, Dottie, I am fine. I feel like I'm in that REM song. It's the end of the world as we know it. And, well, I feel fine. Or that meme of the dog sitting drinking a cup of coffee saying it's fine. And there's, he's surrounded by fire and brimstone. So it does feel, with the UN report out, the spike here in the United States around the Delta variant, it is back to feeling like end of times to me.
It is interesting, Megan. So I was thinking about this the other day. Obviously, the UN report, we are now in code red in terms of climate change and impact on our planet. And yet that's not news. I mean,
No.
Is it? Haven't we known this now for several years? Hasn't it just been getting worse every single year? I mean, hasn't every year been the hottest year on record? Why does it feel so different this year, do you suppose?
Well, I think because people are, one, we've spent the last 18 months thinking about our own demise generally as a world. But secondly, I do think there is some action being taken, or an understanding that this is not going to change by banning plastic straws. It's going to take a whole lot of communal work and effort, and that starts really with the corporations of today's society, which are, bigger than most governments of the world,
I do agree with you. I think, coming out of this kind of an experience, and I say coming out of it, and that's not true either. We're not coming out of COVID. I mean, it does feel very doom and gloom. Megan,
sorry, listeners.
How do we make this show more fun? Oh no, it's so doom and gloom today. Boy, it is just one of those weeks. But it is really fascinating. I was thinking about the interview that we're going to share today that you had with Alan Murray, and I'm so excited that he joined us on the podcast. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that conversation that you had. But I was looking back and reading the very first article that he ever wrote for Fortune when he took over as CEO back in 2014. And it is just, what a different world it was. That was not that long ago, Megan. 2014 to me feels like it was yesterday. And yet when I think about how much has changed for boards and senior leaders of companies in that short period of time, it is really astonishing. I mean, some of the things that he saw happen, it's dramatic. I mean, even just the use of the term stakeholder capitalism as a regular occurrence in boardrooms. I mean, in 2014, that would have been unthinkable. And yet it is kind of standard operating procedure right now for boards to have these big existential level conversations about the future.
Yeah, Dottie. And that's why I was really excited to have Alan with us to talk a little bit about that. And this idea of the modern board, which is really our theme of a new partnership between Diligent and Fortune, where we're going to be highlighting best practices and whatnot related to what boards and how boards need to be operating in sort of this new stakeholder purpose-driven world. And so I'm really excited that there'll be some showcase content on fortune.com and throughout their properties where we get to spend a little more time digging into this more deeply. So I would check out fortune.com for our listeners if they're interested in getting Fortune's perspective and our perspective on how and why boards need to evolve.
Well, and I know, Megan, you and I are both total fangirls of Alan Murray because we read his CEO Daily newsletter cover to cover every single day when it pops into our inboxes in the morning. It is always so full of interesting insight. And Alan, of course, always has his unique take on the issues of the day. Sometimes that unique take is not so popular with the corporate community, and sometimes he's right on the money and everybody agrees with him. But it's always an interesting read and is always just a helpful way to kind of get your arms around what's happening that week. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. That is the CEO Daily newsletter is one that has often appeared on my picks list of things that I encourage other folks in the business community to read.
Agreed. Well, and Megan, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, before we turn over to your interview, we are so excited because Alan is going to be joining us this year at Modern Governance Summit. So he'll be moderating the first big panel session kicking off the conference, which is going to look at the issue of changing organizational culture in line with all of these conversations about leading with purpose and stakeholder capitalism. And he's going to be leading an all-star panel. Joining him on the panel is going to be Hubert Joly, who's also been a guest on the podcast. Former CEO and chairman of Best Buy. He's also going to be joined by Charles Phillips, who's the managing partner and co-founder of Recognize, and also by Robin Washington, who's a strategic advisor and a board member on the boards of Alphabet, Honeywell International, and Salesforce. So really quite an all-star lineup to talk about this issue of shifting organizational culture and how that plays into thinking about stakeholder capitalism.
Love it. Love it. And Dottie, I want you to give one more plug for Modern Governance Summit because this is a totally free event. Who else are you most excited for? Give me one name.
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Okay, but if I can give you I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you two names. So we have been able to secure two incredible speakers to come sort of later in the conference. And that is Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, who will be joined for a fireside chat with Robert F. Smith, the founder, chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners. And that conversation is going to be about the changing nature of wealth and how wealth has the power to change the world in these new and interesting ways. Probably couldn't get two better people to talk about that issue, considering what they both do for a living, and really excited to see what they have to say at the summit this year.
Well, check out Modern Governance Summit, folks. And I think with that, let's tee up the conversation with Alan. Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Alan Murray, CEO of Fortune Media. I'm really excited to have Alan join us to help kick off a new collaboration between Diligent and Fortune to address themes and issues relevant to the modern board. Alan, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you and great to be in partnership with Diligent.
Wonderful. Well, we live in a moment, I think it can be confirmed by all of us and all of our listeners, that we are being challenged as leaders like never before. And we've talked at length on this show about the rise and impact of stakeholder capitalism, ESG, the purpose of corporations. And among your many duties, you write the wildly successful Fortune CEO Daily newsletter. And I would love to start and hear your take on how the role of the CEO is changing as stakeholder capitalism takes root.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, Megan. I think there are three things going on that are dramatically changing the way leaders approach large organizations. The first one is just the rapid pace of change in technology, which preceded the pandemic, but was accelerated by the pandemic. I mean, the rate of change of new technologies and the power of these new data technologies, the ability to collect data from anywhere, to analyze it with powerful machine learning algorithms, to digitize it, put everything in the cloud, allow anyone to access it anywhere, it really is enabling a complete rethinking of the corporation and is a challenge for leaders and for boards. The second is, as you said, this rise in focus on stakeholders, which I think is related to the technology piece, that leaders today are less about telling their employees what to do, more about creating a vision and a direction and an inspiration and a motivation for those employees. And employees want them to be doing good things in the world. And so that's really caused a much greater focus on social issues and not just financial issues. And that was all happening also before the pandemic. The Business Roundtable's statement on stakeholder capitalism came in August of 2019, so 6 months or so before the pandemic started. But it also accelerated during the pandemic. To my surprise, by the way, I thought when people saw their finances going south, they'd say, oh, let's put all these stakeholder concerns and environmental concerns on the back burner and focus on the financial health of the company. But they didn't. The nature of the crisis caused people to double down. And then the third piece is just the remarkable opportunity or demand that we rethink the nature of work that's been created by the pandemic. Knowledge workers all went home for a year and a half, and now they're coming back, but figuring out how to come back. I said, does it really make sense for me to be in an office every day? Should I continue to spend several days a week someplace else? Everybody's talking about hybrid. Nobody knows what hybrid means. And how do you actually make hybrid work? If you've got 3 people in the office and 3 people on a Zoom call, how do you make sure that everybody is on an equal footing and collaborating? And so all of that is just leading to a fundamental rethinking of how we work. And so those 3 trends colliding at this moment, I think, are creating a bigger challenge than I've ever seen in my 4 decades covering business, both for leaders and for boards.
So in light of that, let's talk about the board. How should the role of the board be evolving? Unpack a little bit this concept of what it means to be a modern board now.
Yeah. Well, boards used to think of themselves as keepers of the strategy. It was their job to make sure the strategy was intact. I think now it's much more keepers of the value, to make sure that the guardrails are in place and the direction is appropriate and the values are in place. And that's a new thing. I was talking to a board member, Dambiso Moyo, who has just written a book on boards, who said to me, she's on multiple boards. She said, I've been involved in several CEO replacements where we had to get rid of an existing CEO and put in a new one. She said none of them were based on financial performance. None of them were based on financial performance. Now, that may be an extreme, but I think that tells you something, that there's a whole set of values and concerns that have to be taken into account at the board level that go beyond financial metrics. And putting in place the structures and the checks and balances and the appropriate oversight and risk management to deal with that is a huge challenge, and one that I think companies are just beginning to get their arms around.
So do any companies or CEOs come to mind that are doing a good job blazing this path, being values-led organizations?
Oh, I have some favorites. I look at somebody like Dan Schulman at PayPal and what he's done there, or even Doug McMillon at Walmart. I think there are a number of people. In the retail space, I'd point to Corey Berry at Best Buy and her predecessor, Hubert Joly. I mean, Best Buy is a company that probably 10 years ago, I would have said, why does this company even exist? I mean, who needs a big box store to get your electronics? I can go to Amazon and just order them and have it sent to my house. And they, by really understanding their customers, they've reinvented, and being empathetic about solving the problems of their customers, they've reinvented the business. So you see a lot of really interesting examples out there.
So speaking of Walmart, of Amazon, with companies like Amazon saying they now want to be the greatest employer on earth, and Walmart and now Target offering education benefits to all associates, do you think we're entering a new arms race for talent?
No question. Many CEOs have said to me over the last few months that this is the greatest competition for talent they've ever seen. It's been building for some time. And Megan, the reason for that is, if you think about it historically, is pretty clear. Colin Meyer wrote a book called Prosperity that I would recommend to your listeners. But one of the facts he underscores in there is that if you go back to the 1970s and you look at the balance sheets of the Fortune 500 corporations, more than 80% of the value on the balance sheets of Fortune 500 companies was stuff. It was plant, equipment, inventory, oil in the ground. It was physical stuff. If you do the same exercise today, more than 85% of the value is intangibles. Well, what does that mean? It's like intellectual property. It's the value of the brand. It's all the stuff that's created by people. So human capital has just become a much bigger part of the enterprise than it used to be. And financial and physical is just less important than it used to be. And I think that's one of the reasons why the talent battle is so intense, because it's human capital at the end of the day that's going to determine who wins. So
I want to talk a little bit about the human capital piece of things, and this idea that, we think about ESG, we think about marrying these things together in, I think, a way that organizations have never done before. Do we think we're really going to get to the place in the next 5-10 years where these non-financial measures really do become material? Or do we think it's really kind of just talk right now still?
I would come down somewhere in between. I mean, some of it is talk, but increasingly it's becoming real. Let me give you an example. I had a conversation recently with the CEO of Moller-Maersk, the big shipping company that moves the giant container boxes all over the world. And he had just finished a partnership with Ørsted, a Danish energy company, that's going to build windmills way out in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic, basically, in order to power plants to create hydrogen fuel. So that's a pretty cool thing, right? But I was talking to this guy from Moller-Maersk. I said, "You're not a particularly woke CEO. Why are you doing this?" And he said, "I'm doing it because my customers are demanding it. Most of the companies that ship stuff on my ships have now made commitments to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050 throughout their supply chain. And they're coming to me and saying, how are you going to do this? I just signed a commitment to net zero 2050. You've got to move my goods from place to place without burning carbon fuel." So you're starting to see not just talk, but real actions taking place in the economy that will get us there. So I think it's real. It's still a bit amorphous. It's still a bit unclear how we're going to do it, but companies are increasingly serious about their commitments.
One of the hot button issues this year has been CEOs speaking out on a variety of political and social justice issues. You're in an interesting spot as a journalist and also a CEO. So how do you think about which issues you want to tackle head on? How do you think about sort of the backlash that comes with taking a stance on some of these issues as a media organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing I'd emphasize, Megan, is as a journalist, I know firsthand how dramatic this change is. I mean, 10 years ago, if you went to a CEO of any major company and tried to get them to talk about a hot button political issue that didn't directly affect their bottom line, they would tell you to go jump in the lake. I mean, their position would be to get under the desk and hide. And the notion that the CEO of Bank of America would speak out in favor of transgender access to public bathrooms, which he did just 5 years ago. 10 years ago, the notion that any of them would do that is just mind-blowing. And in fact, to take a more trenchant example, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, what year was that? I think it was probably 2015. You go back and look and see if there was a single CEO of a major company who had anything to say about that. I've done it. You can't find it. It's not that they thought it was not a bad thing. It's just like, that's not my job. I'm running the company. I'm not going to speak out about what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. And then you go to last year when, you had the killing that sparked the reaction. The number of CEO comments was just stunning. Every company was out there speaking. That's just in 6 years. So it's a dramatic change. I do think it's a challenge. It's hard to know when to speak out and when not to speak out. You can't speak out on everything. It won't be effective. And I can tell you there are a lot of CEOs right now having heartburn because they want to speak out on these issues for the sake of racial justice and for the sake of their employees, but they don't want to get caught in a fight between Republicans and Democrats. That's the last place they want to be. So I think companies are struggling with it, but it's not going to go away because it's an important component of leadership today.
As we head into the close of 2021, which I can't believe is just around the corner, I'm not sure it's unfolding quite the way we had all hoped it would have unfolded. And I'd love to know from your perspective, are there any stories, issues that you and the Fortune team are following closely as it relates to what companies need to be thinking about?
Well, I think we're paying very close attention to the two that we've talked about. One is commitment to stakeholder goals intensified during the pandemic. So how are companies going to follow through on all of these commitments. And Megan, part of that is metrics. I mean, we have elaborate accounting structures to measure return to shareholders, but we've got almost nothing to measure return to stakeholders. And you're seeing some work being done on creating metrics, but I think a lot of companies are wrestling with, is it real? Isn't it real? How do we make it real, et cetera? So I think that's one big issue. And the second issue is the return to work, and what does it look like? And it really is a kind of a great opportunity to rethink the way we do work. There are no straightforward answers or clear answers, but it's an opportunity that's not going to be around for a long time. We'll start freezing into new habits pretty quickly. And so companies need to be really thoughtful and intentional about how they recreate the office and the workplace and the practices of the workplace over the course of the next 3, 4, 6 months.
On your LinkedIn, you say you have been a journalist since the age of 9. So I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't get your perspective on where journalism and media is headed as an industry. I think talk about a category that has been disrupted every which way to Sunday, but is really still, I think, obviously important to the world around us.
And look, I think I became a journalist. I don't really know because I was only 9 and I I was just walked up and down the street asking people questions and writing down their answers. But I think I did it because it was a method of lifelong learning. I loved hearing about what was happening in the world and thinking about what was happening in the world and reporting about what was happening in the world. And that's so important and will always continue to be important and continue to be valued. That said, we got a couple of bad trends that coincided here. One is the business model of journalism broke down. It was based on advertising in the legacy publications. And what we discovered was at the end of the day, the advertisers didn't really care about journalism. They just cared about eyeballs, and they found a cheaper way to get their eyeballs. And so we have to reinvent the business model. That's one problem. And then the other problem is just the explosion of platforms that allow anyone to be a journalist without any check on accuracy or quality that have led to an explosion of bad information, of a destruction of facts. And this bizarre notion that, it was the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Well, in fact, today people think they are entitled to their own facts. And they just find the right people to follow on Facebook to give them the facts that make them feel comfortable. That's a horrible thing. And we have to figure out a way to establish some basis for arriving at some common agreements about things, about facts and truth to base our society on. We can still have disagreements, but we have to be able to reach agreement on fundamental facts of our life and our society.
Well, Alan, if you'll indulge me, I have a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests. The first is, what do you think will be the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
I think the biggest difference between boardrooms today and boardrooms 10 years from now will be much more attention to non-financial metrics. You're already seeing it happen, but it's going to accelerate over the course of the next decade. And they'll have to get their arms around them and pay more attention to them in devising the strategy and direction for the company.
What is the last thing you read, watched, listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
I did read the biography of George Marshall, which was, that was quite a long time ago and quite a different era. But he was a leader, we always hear about Patton. You always hear about the military leader who's absolutely convinced of directions and takes the hammer in order to lead people. And Marshall was an incredibly wise, empathetic, thoughtful, and inspiring leader. And I think it does make you think about governance in different ways.
Great pick. Lastly, Alan, what is your current passion project?
Well, we've already talked about it. Look, I think the nature of corporate leadership has changed more in the last 10 years than it did in the previous century. And I finally decided that I'd spent enough time thinking about this that I needed to write a book. So I have a book coming out, My Journey to Find the Soul of Business, that I hope will shed some light on this change and why it's happening. I think it's a good thing. I think it's making companies better. That doesn't mean that every company will be good, but I think it's probably a source of significant hope for our society. I don't see much hope in government these days, so I'm hoping there's hope in business.
Well, I look forward to reading that when it comes out and having you back on the show to talk a little bit more about that book. So, Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'll be happy to do it. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for that interview. What a pleasure to hear from Alan Murray. And by the way, shout out to him for when we asked him for his pick for, what to read. He had to say his own book. Come on now. Of course he did. But I can't wait to read that book. And I was reflecting on the fact that, he's leading this session at Modern Governance Summit with an author of a book by the name of The Heart of Business. And so Alan is writing about the soul of business. So maybe at some point someone will write about the brain of business, and then we'll really have the 3-part series that you need to know about business.
And we can venture off to the join or see the Wizard of Oz there.
Exactly. Well, Megan, thank you so much. It was just a great interview. And that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. Once again, I'm Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, joined by Megan Day, Senior Director of Board Member Experience for Diligent Corporation. I'd like to say a few special thank yous, first and foremost, to business guru Alan Murray, podcast producer Kira Ciccarelli, the team at Sweetfish Media for making this podcast a reality, and most especially Diligent Corporation for sponsoring the show. Please let us know what you think of the show by rating us on Apple Podcasts, by contacting us on Twitter at DirectorPod, online at diligent.com/podcast, or by email at podcast@diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.